Welcome to our July WEAll Talk. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us here today, for spending this hour and a half together, where Donnie is actually offering very generously his time to take us in a journey. He's going to lead us into a really, really nice experiment that I know nothing about, and that is the beauty of what is going to happen today. So for those who are, this is the first time that you're joining a WEAll Talk. WEAll Talks were meant and are meant to create a safe space where people can discuss, where they can talk, where they can share, where they can connect and grow together. And today's going to be a little bit different because it's usually 1 hour long. Today is going to be an hour and a half, and it's going to be a little bit different as well, because Donnie is different and because he is bringing something different to our community, and we are always welcoming these new ideas. So I hope that everybody is ready for that. And you're all going to need paper and a pen. So if you need a minute to get it, I'm going to give it to you, but make sure that you're going to have paper and a pen to join us in this journey. So Donnie Maclurcan is the Executive Director of the Post Growth Institute, one of our founder members, and an international business consultant. And having worked with over 500 non-for-profit projects and businesses across 32 countries, including time base in Egypt, South Korea, Kenya, Fiji, the US, and Australia. His own non-for-profit initiatives include co-development of the offers and needs market, which probably some of you recognize us because we learned so much from them that we included it in our members' goals. The Free Money Day, the Ashland Bike Brigade, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, the Enrich List, the Post Growth Alliance, and the Not-for-Profit Way Training. An affiliate professor of economics of Southern Oregon University and a fellow of the Royal Society for the Arts, Donnie likes improv theater and singing a cappella. Let's see, we're going to have time for that when we finish this WEAll Talk. So thank you all. Thank you so much for joining us today. And Donnie, the mic is yours. I hope I'm not forgetting anything, Donnie. If so, just remind me.
Perfecto. Gracias, Ana. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, everybody. Our bodies are such amazing things. They have so much to share with us, so many insights. And today we're going to get to see what insights your body has to tell you about the economy. So what I'd like everyone to do is just get that piece of paper and pen. Just take a moment here if you haven't got that yet. Just a piece of paper and a pen. And we're going to go on a short journey together here in just a moment. So I'll just give everyone a few seconds to get that pen and paper ready, and then we'll get started. So what I'd like you to do is on your paper, just draw a line down the center of the page. And in the top right of your paper, write the word future. And in the top left, write the word present. We're going to be starting on the right-hand side here. And what I'd like you to do is imagine a world and an economy that's working for everyone, all species. Just imagine that for a moment. And once you've connected with that imagination, drop down into your body, maybe drop your chin a little, maybe close your eyes if that feels comfortable for you, and feel in your body how that economy that's working for everyone, how does it feel? And when you've connected with the feeling, draw a symbol or a shape without lifting your pen or pencil on the page that represents how it feels. A symbol or a shape without lifting your pen that represents that feeling. Just a few more moments there for people. Okay, and now we're going to move over to the left-hand side. How does the present economy feel? Drop into that feeling, and again, draw a symbol or a shape that represents that feeling without lifting your pen. Okay, so I'm going to share with you the results of this experiment that we've been conducting at the Post-Growth Institute for over 7 years now, all around the world, across all sorts of cultures and demographics, and the surprising outcome across those demographics. And in a moment after that, you'll have a chance to share your results, and then we're going to move into breakouts where you'll get to talk about what you drew and what you observed. So, and some of you may have done this before, and we'll see how your experience lines up this time, also in regards to others here. So I just need Anna for you to give me the hosting ability so I can share my screen.
You can do it now.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to just go here, whoops. So here we have, what's interesting is across all demographics, people draw one of four things primarily for the future that they imagine. And you'll notice they are all of a non-linear nature. So we have a circle, an infinity symbol, a spiral, or a heart. Let's just see if you put in the chat here if you had one of those, or a close variation, or a combination sometimes of those. Just put a Y in the chat if that was if you drew something similar to that, and then we'll get everyone to hold theirs up in just a moment. So let's just see people hold theirs up, maybe just on screen so that you can have a look at each other's there. I see an infinity symbol, a heart. Someone drew a heart there. Okay, some nice elaborate drawings as well. Great, thank you everyone. And then now we move over to the present. And what's interesting is, again, across demographics, we have people drawing similar things that are all linear. So we typically see a jagged line, a triangle, a downward arrow, or a mess of lines. Again, if you drew something that was one of those, or a close variation or a combination, just put a Y in the chat. And let's just hold up now and just have a look at what people were drawing there. Yeah, I see the triangle. I see the jagged line. Again, I see some beautiful elaborate drawings there as well. Thank you, everyone. And so I'm going to, without analyzing this, just send you out into breakouts now for you to reflect on this experiment and to share with each other. And I'm going to tell you the sequence for that sharing in just a moment. But then we're going to come back and have a little bit of a debrief on this experience. And the one thing I want to say is that having run this experiment all around the world, it's been done with audiences that are pro-growth, post-growth, degrowth, pro-capitalist, pro-free market, pro-heavily regulated markets, the whole lot, different ages, different religious backgrounds, political persuasions. And people consistently draw similar things for the future and similar things for the present, despite those differences. So without any further prompting, I'm going to just put in the chat here. Thanks for joining us, Philip. This is the sequence for our breakout. So you're going to be in rooms of 4. And the first thing I encourage you to do is to create a speaking order, and to do that just by renumbering yourself. And you can do that by hovering over your profile, or over in the on the right-hand side where you've got participants. You can rename yourself. Click on the 3 dots there. And for example, you'll see I can rename myself and put a number, either 1, 2, 3, or 4, in front of my name. And that way you'll just self-assemble your speaking order at the beginning so that you don't have that awkwardness around who's going first, etc. So renumber just for a minute at the beginning. And then I'm encouraging you to introduce yourself with your name, maybe your location, why you're passionate about this topic, just a brief little piece about that. So it's only 1 minute for each, so a 4-minute total. And then the next bit is, the next round after you've all introduced yourself is, what did you draw and why? And what do you feel underlies any differences between what you drew for the future and the present? And you'll have about 3 minutes each, 12 minutes total. So the total time, Anna, if you can set this up, is going to be 17 minutes. Maybe make it 18 minutes, give people a good chance to meet. And I'm going to now give you a minute to just reflect on these things before you go in so that you're not having to think while you're actually in the conversation. So just think about why you're passionate about this topic. Why did you draw what you drew? And what do you feel underlies any differences? Just take a minute to reflect on those 3 pieces as you can see them in the chat. Okay, I think we're ready for the breakouts. We'll see you back in about 18 minutes, everyone.
Welcome back. Donnie, where are you? I lost you in, okay, there you are. Oh, yours.
All right, everyone. Well, I hope you had some really interesting explorations there. Thank you so much. We're going to take 30 seconds now to reflect on another question, which is, what surprised you in that breakout group, or what do you take away from it? Is there anything that came through that was really interesting to you? Anything that maybe shifted for you, or any observations you have, anything you feel that would be worth sharing with this wider group? We're going to take 30 seconds now to reflect on those questions, and then I'm going to see if anyone feels drawn to share. But just take 30 seconds of silence to reflect. Is there anything that you feel drawn to share with the group here about your experience or observations?
I would really appreciate some, because I could not join any of the calls. And it would be fantastic to hear some of them.
Sure. Yeah, we'll get people to share a little bit about what they maybe also show their drawings when you do your sharing. So we'll just take a few more seconds there to see if anyone has anything that's emerging. Just take a few more seconds of silence, then we'll come back. Would anyone like more time for reflection? Just put a Y in the chat. Great, we'll just take another 20 seconds there. Would anyone like more time to reflect? Just put a Y in the chat. Okay, and before we move into sharing, I just want to make an observation. You'll see that I'm taking a fair amount of time for silent reflection. And that's because, lining up with today's conversation, I'm interested in embodied practice and inclusivity associated with our discussions. And I know that there are probably people in this room who might consider themselves more introverted than extroverted. And in those circumstances in particular, my understanding is it's difficult often when someone asks a question to then immediately speak to that question without actually feeling into what it is that you'd like to share. And that, I think, is the case for everyone on some level as well. And so I wonder how often our conversations around these sorts of topics around which we're passionate become conversations that are exclusive because we ask questions and expect answers straight away. And then to what extent, in doing that, does the conversation move up into this realm of the body, of the intellect? Who can respond fastest from a space of knowledge and rational thought, for example, versus dropping down into, what do I really feel about the answer to that question? What's going on for me right now? What do I notice, etc.? So that's just a little explainer as to why I use the long silences here, and then ask if anyone would like more time so that we don't move forward with the conversation until people have really felt like they're ready to share. So on that note, let's see if there are maybe 3 people who'd like to share, up to 3 people. Just put a Y in the chat if you'd like to share. And for Anna's sake, if you can share maybe your drawings as well and a little explanation, and then any of your observations that you'd like to share. So just put a Y in the chat if you're feeling drawn to share a reflection on this experiment. And it can just be a brief comment. It could be something you noticed. It could be something about your own experience. You might want to even share what you shared in the breakout room. Just see if there are a few people who'd like to share. All right, maybe not so much. I have a feeling there's one person out there who's wanting to share, but we'll give it just another moment in case. Just feel free to put a Y in the chat if you would. Great, Roxana, thank you so much. If you just want to bring yourself off mute, Roxana, and when you're ready. And then Telma, thank you.
I think in our group, it was interesting to notice how everybody agreed that change is needed. Like we all came here with some sort of understanding or frustration even about the current state of the world. And that is interesting because it's not, it might feel like everybody can see that the path we're on is basically suicidal. But it's not the case. There are so many people wrapped up into the story that we've been told about what the purpose of life should be, which is basically, you know, the value that the economy is giving us, and how the forgotten are simply the people who are being rejected by the economy. But I think what I saw in the 5 people, the stories they told, is that they understood, that we all understood, that we simply cannot go on like that.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that, Oksana. Really appreciate that and your reflections from the group as well. And would you mind sharing what you drew just for Anna's sake? And if anyone's joining the experiment, we were asking people to draw what does a future that works for everyone, what does that feel like, which is that side there. You drew a circle. And what does the present economy feel like? And you
like a triangle.
Triangle, right. And we'll go back to those shared results in just a moment. So thank you so much, Roxana. Telma.
Yes. What is just reaffirmed in my assumptions in the sharing of my group is how connected we are and how similar realities we are living no matter where we are in the world. And the beauty of being in WEAll network, being so global, is that we really can sense that and do that sense making. What is happening in the world is that we have a broken system, and we all sense that, feel that in our bodies, in our minds, in our hearts, and we wish for a hopeful future, a thriving future. So we all have the same vision for the future, no matter where we are in the world. And this is very humane. And it was beautiful just to have that reaffirmation that we are the ones we have been waiting for. It's up to us, no matter where we are.
Oh, thanks for sharing that, Telma. I'll speak to that a little more a little later, but just to remind, and for those who've just joined us, this experiment, I've been running it for 7+ years now, and I've done it in groups of corporate executives in for-profit businesses who didn't know anything about post-growth or ecological limits, like it wasn't on their radar, and they draw the same things. So what you say there, Telma, of course, here's a group of people that have self-assembled with some bias, perhaps, with respect to the passion around these topics, but I've run this experiment in groups that aren't linked to any of these conversations, and same results.
And I was so blown away because I was one of those just repeating the pattern. I draw the infinity for the future, and I draw the
Well, could you hold it up actually? Yeah, could
oh,
we
wait, I did on a Word document, so I needed to share my screen.
Yeah, well, maybe.
Yeah, it will be more complicated, but I did a chaos drawing. I started with infinity in the present, and then I was trying to disconnect, but you said you cannot lift the pen. And then I started
The mess of
the chaos. Yeah, messing the infinity.
Great, thank you so much, Thelma. Amanda, and then we'll see if there's anyone else who feels drawn to share before we move on to the next phase. So Amanda.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I really enjoyed our group discussions. And I think also hearing about why people are passionate about this as the entryway also into the discussion of those different visions was really useful and interesting. So within our group, there are some really beautiful, I think, feelings and perspectives on the economy, which became articulated. So for example, this feeling that it's just so dominant, like everything's about the economy and it shouldn't be. Somebody mentioned that it feels suffocating. Yeah, it's just like the heaviness. And so then their illustration of the future economy was a feather, yeah, like a lightness to it, which I thought was really beautiful. A lot of sort of, reflections on, like how it makes us really separate from one another and the lack of connection as in their current sort of system, and the need for much more integrated and holistic mechanisms. But in some ways, I guess for me, it's about that holism, but also actually that holism requires the economy itself and the importance of the economy and the centrality of the economy to be dispersed relative to all of the various aspects, spiritual, intellectual, material, whatever, of life. So appreciate that.
Great. Oh, thanks so much, Amanda, for sharing that as well, and from your group. And Diana, we'll have you share, and then Niels, I believe, wants to share as well. So we'll hear from you, Diana, and then Niels.
Thanks. Yeah, I was just going to say that something else that came out in our group, I was in the same group as Amanda, was this feeling of, kind of, especially with young people trying to work out maybe their careers, what they're going to do with their life, and feeling kind of trapped in the current paradigm. It's like you've got to get a job, and then you've got to pay rent, and you've got to all this stuff which is very difficult to get away from. So it's a bit of a cage, the current environmental system.
Yeah, thanks so much, Diana, for bringing that back to that very real reality for so many. Niels.
Okay, yeah. So I think, and like our group made a really interesting analogy or like a metaphor with a wave, but I wasn't really sure, like I wasn't really ready to talk. Maybe like someone of our group can like comment. Yeah, sorry.
Oh, sorry. I got a message saying that you wanted to share, so.
Sorry. I don't know. Maybe I clicked on something, but.
No worries. Just if you feel drawn to share anything, not a problem.
Yeah. But it's really interesting, and I hope that Yannick or.
Is there anyone else in Niels's group that feels drawn to share?
Who can explain it better than I can?
Anyone else in Niels's group?
Sure. Or there's John. No, John came up with the analogy, so let's let John do it.
But it was really interesting how everyone just built on it.
I was the odd person out for the future. I didn't draw an enclosed thing. I drew a very smooth waveform. And for the present, I drew a very choppy, static waveform. And so we had a pretty good riff on that with relating that to the ones that the others in the group drew. And it was a rich discussion. I don't know how much more I can say about it.
Well, that's great. Thanks, John, because originally the data showed us that it was a wave sign and then it moved into infinity over the years. And so we consider the wave sign just the top level of the infinity symbol, right? So it's the same piece, just a variation. So thank you for sharing that. I'm going to share with you my observations having run this experiment and worked in the post-growth economic space for over a decade. To me, the real takeaway here, and why I'm not diving in with this talk into macroeconomic theory or microeconomic analysis, is because I get so much more hope from this kind of piece than I do from talking about from intellectualizing questions of policy or economic theory or economic practice. And the reason is, as alluded to, especially with what you were saying there, Thelma, the fact that people around the world, across cultural differences, across ideological belief, and I live in the US at the moment, and I've never seen such division before across ideological lines, stoked by many things, of course. But the fact that people, when they drop into their bodies, feel into the same thing, and I'm going to just share with those who maybe joined after our, let me just set this up here 1 second. So I'll just do it on this way. This will be a little roundabout way, but there we go. So that people drew, we'll go to the end here where we can see the comparison, right? That people drew, and I'm checking you can see my screen here. Can people see my screen?
No.
Oh, great. I didn't have it on share yet.
Do it again. Yeah.
Great. Now we can. So that people draw consistently something non-linear for the future. And that's the real centrality, is the non-linear nature.
It's just, sorry, Donnie, it's just a white screen, so we can't see any images.
Yeah, there's something, there we go. Thank you so much for bringing that to my attention. But now you should be able to see it, right?
All good.
Yeah. So the fact that people draw consistently across cultures something non-linear for the future, or a close variation or combination, and something linear, to me is fascinating. It highlights, as Thelma was saying, that within each of us, there is a shared story. But it's not just that there's a shared vision, there's also a shared story about the present. And what surprises me is that very few people ever, especially when I've done this with free market advocates or pro-capitalist, like people who are very, very pro-capitalist, they typically don't ever draw anything circular about the present. That's interesting to me. And I'll get to that in just a moment. But what I find even more interesting than the aspects of what's not drawn and what that may mean is that if we understand that the starting point is commonality and the ability to drop into wisdom and to feel the same things. In other words, our wisdom tells us that we need something circular and non-linear, just as nature thrives on that non-linearity, on that circularity, whether it's nitrogen or oxygen flowing in our ecosystem. Same with our bodies, with blood and oxygen. You know, we thrive on that circulation, and we struggle, and often things die when certain things accumulate in systems and there isn't that balance. But what surprises me and excites me the most is that the standard conversation, and in fact the standard opening, if you were to pull a book from a shelf, if you've got any books about economics or the future, you'll typically see, and you can do this experiment perhaps after this time together here, you'll typically find that the first chapter is about what's wrong and what's not working. And it sets up an intellectual debate to say, here's the problem and here's how we fix it, usually in the last chapter or so. And that standard sort of starting with what's wrong and moving into how we fix it is very common. I'm seeing some people nod about that experience, right? It's a lot about the way that we present information takes us into, especially if you start with what's wrong and someone's on another ideological side to you of this conversation, or perceives that they are, what's the immediate reaction? They're going to think your diagnosis of the problem is problematic. They're going to go to high conflict. Maybe it's not high conflict, but they're going to move into conflict. And it's going to become an intellectual debate, right? Of my idea is better than yours. You're wrong in regards to this, this, and this piece. My primary takeaway for you here is not touching on economic theory, is not touching on any of the intellectual aspects of this, is that what would happen if you, in your engagements around these issues, sought to drop people into their bodies as the opening point for your engagement around your passion in this area or your interest in this area. Whether you work on finance or B corporations or donut economics or reducing consumption or public healthcare, what would happen if you created, and you need safety, you need to create a space of safety for people to feel that they can drop into their bodies? Because just like silence and things that involve internal processes, a lot of people freak out in a patriarchal system. So what would it look like for us to think about the entry point into these explorations? Because I'll tell you what happens next when I've talked to corporate executives in Fortune 500 companies and started with this drawing experiment. They draw a circle for the future typically, and they draw the jagged line for the present. And then I say, that's interesting. Tell me about that. And then I ask, they tell me about that, and they say many of the things you've said right now. And this is people who, like, if we'd started with a different conversation, would have been saying, you know, this is great. You know, market is the capitalist market is the best way to allocate goods and services most efficiently, and we need to deregulate more, and this, and this way. We're not starting there. We're starting with, how do you feel about the present? And then I say, okay, so you didn't draw anything circular for the present. You drew something linear. Interesting. What's not circulating? And where they'll get to is they'll say, ultimately, money's not circulating. Money is accumulating. Sometimes they'll say wealth, sometimes they'll say power, not so much. Typically, they'll come to an acceptance or an acknowledgement that it's money that's not circulating. And we're talking here about people who are like very pro deregulation, which, as we know, is one of the quickest ways that money accumulates in the system. But of course, a regulated response in a capitalist system also involves monetary accumulation. It just hides it better. In any capitalist system, money accumulates. That's the fundamental principle of capital accumulation and the way it plays out. It accumulates faster than it's distributed. And so what does that mean to start conversations with the people that we're engaging with, or explorations in people's bodies, so that we can connect with that shared wisdom? I think it means everything. I honestly think that the more we do those kinds of practices, the more we open up a very different kind of space, a much more creative space, because what then happens in my experience is that when I then overlay an economic theory that just draws on what they have said is their experience, I say, right, so you said it's not circulating, we need to move to something more circulatory, non-linear. Okay, what's not circulating? Money. All right, what would it look like for money to circulate? Then we ultimately end up at the not-for-profit economic model that Jennifer Hinton and myself worked on for 8 years in understanding. And I mean, I always find it interesting that I have no background in economics. I've never been in an economics class ever. I haven't studied economics 101. I don't know macro from micro with respect to what it looks like in a classroom. I'm currently a professor of economics at a university in an honorary position. But how did I get that, other than my white male privilege, which was a big part of it? But other than that, it's because I was interested in exploring what felt right, what the wisdom is. And Indigenous populations continue to hold this insight of what the body shares with us. It's why so many cultures would sit in circle, particularly the women would sit in circle and feel into what needs to be done. I think there's a lot to that. I think that opens up a lot of opportunities for us. And I'd like to just go back to discussion now, rather than going into any of the economic stuff that overlays on this, because I'm sensing that for some of you, this might be a point that you'd like to just reflect. So let's take 30 seconds of silence and then open it back up for reflections. I'd love to hear what you have to say about what you're hearing and experiencing right now. So let's take 30 seconds of silence. to feel in your body what you're feeling right now.
Okay, I'm sorry, can I speak?
Just a second there, Arturo. We'd love to hear from you, but we're just going to take a few more seconds of silence and then we'll come
Okay,
over.
sorry.
Thank you so much. We'll just take another 20 seconds and then we'll come back to you. Would anyone like more time to reflect? Just put a Y in the chat. Okay, so we'll hear from Arturo first, and then if anyone else feels drawn to share, just put a Y in the chat and we'll know to call on you. So Arturo, and feel free to type a comment if you have a reflection and you prefer to just type it rather than speak. Arturo, yes.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry. I want to question if you are reading about donut economic of Kate Radford. I think that she talked about the topic that you are showing to us about the fears about the economy and the new possibilities of our world for future. I don't know if it's in a right way. It could be talking here or not.
Yeah, thank you so much for raising that. Absolutely. The donut economics is then an avenue that I think naturally builds on this experiment today. Where I'm looking to sort of emphasize at the moment is the sequencing and how we bring people into conversations around donut economics. And you know, I love Kate's work. And also from memory, if you look at the first chapter of her book title, it talks from memory about what's wrong and frames it in that way. And I think again is going to talk to a certain audience, but is going to struggle to deeply drop in with respect to that written text, not in terms of the way the work is maybe being shared through groups around the world. But I guess I'm inviting people to consider what that different orientation of dropping into our wisdom and connecting with that might look like in order to increase the chances that people will connect with ideas of like donut economics. So thank you, Arturo.
Thank you.
Wendy, and then we'll see who's next.
Yes. How this makes me feel is kind of joyful that yet another person is exploring embodiment and the wisdom within the intelligence, the natural intelligence of the body that lies beyond the intellect. And you know, to see Otto Sharma do it, to see, this is what the indigenous peoples have been talking about, you know, but to see that becoming part of these conversations, I think is extraordinarily important, because it's that sense that the answers aren't going to come from us all bending our intellects around what we already know or how clever we are or we've got this bit of the equation. I also share the sense that if we can have embodied practice as part of these conversations and stepping back with humility from our wonderful expertise, that like all these extraordinary combination of knowledge and kind of skills and expertise we all have, but to actually have the humility to let that go and say, you know, there is an intelligence that's trying to help us shape what this will look like in the future. I feel very encouraged by that, and I've loved all this, Donnie, so it's nice to meet you.
Oh, thanks so much, Wendy. I'm just feeling that in my heart of that connection of someone else who's also been passionate about this. So thank you for naming that. And look, perhaps for some people, you know, there's very different experiences with this. I don't know, perhaps some of you are sitting here going, yeah, but you know, come on, like, let's get to the economic, let's get to like, what's the model? What's the thing we're going to need to do? And like, come on, I've been in this space for decades, you know, longer than probably since you were born, you know, like whatever these kinds of things that might be coming up for some people. That makes sense. That's part of, I think, what it means to decolonize the experience here, which has emphasized so many things at the expense of others. And as in fact, as people in female gender assigned bodies know all too well, the body is demonized in so many ways, and embodied practice has been shunned and outcast, and people who have been practitioners of embodied practice throughout history, particularly women, have dealt with the oppression associated with, in very real ways, the erasure and the violence towards anything that is embodied. And so that's why, for me, it's so central to bring back into this space, especially for me as a white male, to actually speak about my embodied practice and the intersection with economics. In fact, there's probably not many fields that could do with more embodiment and more heart than the economic field that has been so abstracted in so many ways, and same with corporate finance. So yeah, I'd love to hear who else has something to share here. Diana.
So I'll be just that skeptic, if you like. And I say this as someone who, I feel myself as someone very embodied. Dance has been my, my thing throughout my life. And, I've done the WEAll course, so I understand the Otto Scharmer thing, and I've tried to build in, and I guess I would say, it's a kind of spiritual approach, right, to connection at a something beyond intellectual with each other and the wider world, and various meditative practices and things, and so I get the importance of that in terms of trying to help us individually to envisage and work towards a better future, and have a conception of what that might be like. I think for me, where I find it difficult is that organizations don't have embodiment. Organizations are legal forms that are used to organize our economic life. They have no morals. They have no, at best, they have some vague rules they have to stick to. Primarily, it's about shareholder return. That's their aim, and therefore, I feel that just starting at the individual and embodiment, and trying to get everyone a bit more spiritual, woke, and thinking a bit more about that, I think it's difficult for them to do that within a system which is defined and promoted by corporates as being nothing to do with that, and the corporates themselves are completely unable to access it. Even the MD, even if the MD or the chairman is able to go, oh yes, I did this great workshop at the weekend, and I'm thoroughly in touch with everything. Now here we are back at work, and that there's this dissociation, and so I guess, yes, I'm interested in this, but I'm also not sure that it's going to change the world. I'm sorry to be skeptic, but someone had to do it. You invited it, and it was me.
Thank you so much for your skepticism. I really appreciate it. I'm going to take a moment to just sit with what you shared there and see what I'm drawn to share back. What you're saying makes a lot of sense to me. And where I get excited is because today I'm just presenting one aspect of the kind of work I do, and like many of us, there's multi-dimensions. I work with businesses in converting them over from for-profit to not-for-profit organizations, for example. And I think when you mentioned organizations, that's interesting to me because what I heard you describe was a for-profit organization when you talked about shareholder-based companies. And I think jumping into sort of the big picture here, two of the most invisible stories that to me are fascinating and important for us to understand of the last few centuries. One is the invisible nature of extraction in the economy. how money has constantly been extracted out of the real economy into the bank accounts of individuals and corporations that are for profit. And as a result, the debt that accumulates that sits on the other side of that mathematical equation. But then the other invisible story that is much more inspiring is that almost 20% of our global GDP comes from businesses that have circulation built into their DNA, as in they don't have private individual equity owners. So when you said to me that, when you said to us that thing about organizations don't have morals, they're sort of like these hollow legal entities that just exist and then play into the capitalist narrative in certain ways. I would say all organizations are impacted by capitalism, but not all of them are capitalistic by nature. And so when you think of all the consumer cooperatives in the world, when you think of all of the non-profit organizations that have business models, when you think of all the foundation-owned businesses, and when you think of all the government enterprises, and we could talk about BRAC in Bangladesh here, we could talk about IKEA or Bosch or the Guardian newspaper, or Barcelona Football Club, or the Navy Credit Union in the US. You know, these are very big businesses, and they're not extracting finance out of the real economy. So the fundamental starting point there is different. And what I found is that this aspect of the exploration, well, you're right that lots of people return after like a workshop and they go back into a system that has trapped us. Lots of people don't. That's where, for example, people participate in these kinds of things with us and say, I'd like to shift my business over from a for-profit to a not-for-profit business. Or I'd like to find out more, and we'll steer them over to purpose economy that does big business conversions. And that kind of thing has ripple-on effects, especially because we need early adopters in this space of moving over from extractive models. The focus of circular economy right now, the default for most people out of this kind of conversation in terms of practicality is to move to donut economics or circular economics. For me, the key piece here is about the movement of money, and that's where most of the explorations get to if we deepen in of like, what's not circulating? Oh, it's money. And then that opens up way more agency. So I hear what you were saying there, Diana, about like, and I'm sensing like, where's the agency? This kind of thing is not going to, this spiritual stuff is not going to actually move the needle. What I found is that this avenue in and talking about circulation allows us to talk about, okay, what would it mean to move our money to banks that aren't for profit? What would it mean to move our purchasing? What would it mean to move our advocacy? What would it mean to move our labor to models that are circulatory by design? And that then moves into a very powerful conversation because individuals, and of course, I'm very much focused on systemic change, not wanting to put, as capitalism does, the emphasis on the individual, particularly, you know, as neoliberalism has done. But I'm also interested in whatever strengths exist in the system that we can build on. And I think that most people I encounter have no idea that if they move $100 or £100 or 10,000 pesos from a for-profit bank over to a not-for-profit bank, that they're not just moving that amount of money. With fractional reserve systems, you move the equivalent of what that bank can lend using that capital. So $100 in the US that's moved from a for-profit bank over to a credit union is more like $1,400 transaction. So if you're a student who's got student debt, but you've got $100 in your bank and you do that shift over, that's significant, more than people realize. So I'm fascinated about what the circulation of money, power, and resources, when it's tapped into of this, that's what we need. Then talking about the translation of that into real, for example, talking with business leaders about what would it mean to circulate power within your organization? And looking, you know, and pointing to holacracy and sociocracy and these things that have been used in big corporations to different success levels. But there are always steps, I think, to take this deeper conversation into more of a directional, structured avenue moving forward. Yannick, I think you were next.
Yeah, hi. Maybe it's building a bit on what Diana started too, because certainly operating in the same kind of tension holding space when it comes to the current forms of business. But I tend to like to bring it even to why business in the first place, and trying to highlight to some of the influencers in that space the constraints of imagination, right? So anything to do with the current system, whatever human construct we have, an organization, a business, that was all imagined. So it doesn't come from nature telling us this is how you do business. So then if you're trying to look at a lot of the barriers we're trying to help, surface when people come into the space of, well, I want to redo or do better as a business leader. A lot of it has come down to, well, okay, what's negotiable and what's non-negotiable? What do they feel is negotiable and what do they feel is non-negotiable? And what's interesting, when you do that exercise, they'll often put the laws, all the legal aspects of a corporation, fiduciary, all these kinds of things as non-negotiable. And then it's like that process of helping realize, well, where does that come from? Someone's imagination. And in the end, it was a very, very few amount of someone's, and from a very, very small part of one cultural worldview. And so if you're able to sort of help to switch that dilemma a little bit, to realize, well, what if we unleashed imagination entirely to reconstruct these forms, this manifestation of what we call enterprise and business? What would that look like? And that does, of course, lead to the constraints that people feel, well, I don't have the power over that, but at least that's for later. At least in the beginning, you can kind of figure out what might it look like if even the raison d'être of enterprise was fundamentally shifted. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that, Yannick. It reminds me of Andrew White's work many years ago at Oxford University with executives. I remember I was at Findhorn and he was giving a speech about what he'd learned from talking with executives from Fortune 500 companies, senior executives. And from memory, he said that he would have these 2-hour interviews with them and he'd keep coming back to, but that doesn't seem sustainable. And then they'd say some things and justify, and then he'd say, but that doesn't seem sustainable. And he said that consistently at around the 1.5 hour mark, they would break down in tears. And they'd say, you're right. It's not sustainable. None of it's sustainable. But I don't know any alternative. Every time I meet senior executives in big for-profit businesses, I'm struck by how much their perspectives on business, as Yannick is sort of saying, are siloed and are like narrow. I mean, few people know, and there are major problems, obviously, with Henry Ford and anti-Semitism and where profits from his German Ford-based company went during World War II. But just that aside for a second, few people realize, including here in the US, that Ford, the motor company, went not for profit back in the 30s. That Ford tried to actually take the company not for profit in the early days, and that the Dodge brothers put up a challenge, and that actually defined some of the legal precedents of what a for-profit corporation actually stands for in terms of shareholder revenue, return, etc. But that there was a model that for 7 years, a major pioneering automobile company was not for profit. It was owned fully 100% by a foundation, which is why the Ford Foundation, as problematic as it is, was able to expand globally in the way it did, because it owned all the shares of Ford Automobile Company. Now, who would think that like a pioneer of industrial industrial development would have had the thought to put the company over into a not-for-profit structure? In my experience, the more people are exposed to examples of what's possible, and this is what happens when I talk to people, they're like, what? Really? I didn't know that IKEA was a not-for-profit business. I didn't know that Bosch was primarily foundation owned. I didn't know that the world's most profitable company a few years ago, Saudi Aramco, was at the time fully owned by the government and actually offsets the taxation, which is why you don't have personal income tax in Saudi Arabia, because you've got government subsidization from government enterprise. I didn't know that. Like, just the exposure to alternatives is such a powerful possibility of seeding an alternative. And just thinking here, a lot of my work looks at the competitive advantage that's shifting over time towards models that are more circular. But I've done some thought experiments. They haven't led anywhere yet with CEOs that say, look, if you run a major corporation and you're currently paying dividends, what would you do if you didn't have to pay those dividends? What would you do with your company with that extra budget? You know, with that extra 2.5%, 3%? There's a lot that a CEO and especially a chief financial officer would, and a marketing head would love to do with an extra amount of profits being reinvested. And I say, well, why not have a plan to take your company private over the next 30, 40 years? Like have a phased in program to essentially buy out those shares over time so it doesn't affect the volatility, and take out the extraction of profits that are not serving you, that capital that was put in when you had a float on the market and you ran an IPO, like all of that happened maybe 10, 20 years ago. If you've got enough liquidity, if you've got enough ability as a big company to use debt and to have capital assets that allow you to be flexible with what you need to do, you don't need to be paying out shareholders, absent shareholders around the world. That kind of thing opens up people's thoughts. They're like, I never thought of that. It's as Yannick is saying, like there's just this sort of non-negotiables. It's an expectation about the system has to be this way because it has been this way, and that's what I know. That's what I learned in my MBA. But the economy, the formal market economy is so diverse, and then underpinning it is a diverse informal economy. And the majority of economic interactions in this world, I argue, are not for profit. They're not driven by the profit motive. Someone's just said, can you please work with Google, Facebook, or Amazon? So here's an interesting thing. The person who led the development of Google, the Google Drive, like was involved heavily in the Google Drive, and I think Amanda knows about this as well, and was heavily involved in the Facebook like button, spun off and has set up one project that explicitly talks about post-capitalism, post-colonial system. He's a multimillionaire, and he set up a foundation that is essentially funding post-capitalist work. And this is someone who is central to Google and Facebook. There are stories of hope like this. That's Justin Rubinstein. Stories of hope like this that are emerging because people are increasingly brave enough to engage with the cognitive dissonance. Because that's all this is really about, is we all feel the same thing. We all know what we need in our hearts. We know what kind of future we need, and we know what's wrong with the present. Things aren't circulating. And so anything that denies that is cognitive dissonance. And so really what we're just working with is the extent to which people can live with the cognitive dissonance, which is very stressful. Think of the stress that a lot of people have in this world to be denying the reality that they're feeling inside their body if they give themselves the chance to drop in and feel it. Hugely stressful. Let's help alleviate some of that stress by giving people the spaces to feel into their truth and to imagine something different, not in terms of a future, that's idealized, but building on what's already here. That's the next thing that I always suggest people do is you do this experiment with others, and we're going to just write this up as a little experiment at some point so that you can just have the notes if you want to run this experiment with others and have something to follow. The next trick is to say, so what is good about the present? What is working, and how do we build on that in order to get to that future that we need? And sometimes I'll even start with that. Sometimes I'll start with what's working well and then move into the experiment. I'm going to stop there and just see who else would like to share as we close out here in our last 9 minutes.
Isabel, go ahead.
Thanks. Donnie, I have a question. So I'm really enjoying this, by the way. Yeah, I feel very calm, and therefore like things are coming to my brain. So you're saying like the question you follow up is, okay, what's working in the present? And if you could, kind of control the story or what's being shared, what do you feel like the most important stories that would maybe shift the culture of some of the more extractive or pro-capitalist ventures? Is it looking at different governance structures for businesses, or is it looking at different policies that governments are putting in place, or like what are the, and maybe it's none of those things, but it's like, I think at WEAll, our ethos is that we're amplification, we're the amplification team, right? So we need to amplify these stories that exist. And there's a lot, and it's hard to curate. And so if you've got, 5 stories to share, what are the most important ones that you feel that influence the audiences that not necessarily aren't open to, but aren't even aware of what's possible?
It's such a great question. I interpret that as like, where are the acupuncture points? What's worth amplifying in order to get the greatest return on the time invested in amplifying things? I'll share a little. Here's a system that Jen Hinton and I came up with that analyzes layers of any system. And so these 6 things here: behaviors, feelings, conditions, frameworks, values, and constructs, are layers that we discovered after analyzing, building on Donella Meadows' work, Ken Wilber, other people's work in the systems change space, in order to understand, like, by what means can we look at, what's a lens for looking at the different layers of work? And so the first thing to say is, before I actually jump back to this, most people, I think, struggle with, in fact, I'm going to just put this up here as well, because this will intersect in a second. So this is the test that I've come up with for, like, is something post-growth? Does an activity, policy, or approach increase the overall circulation of money, power, and resources without simultaneously increasing the overall accumulation of money, power, and resources in any way? Right, so does it allow circulation without accumulation also? Because we often see things that are like circular economy in this regard, and behind the scenes, they're accumulating certain aspects of money, power, and wealth that get missed, right? The point of these 2 things coming together with the 6 layers is that lots of groups work on different layers at different times. And the question I think we've both had, like, there's often tension between groups of, like, my layer is more important than yours. This is more important acupuncture point. And the reality is we need all of the layers. When we analyzed social systems change, we found that the key thing was you had to have all of the layers ready for a aha moment of a collective shift. If you had one layer missing and it wasn't primed for change, then the shift wouldn't happen. So the reality is we need all the layers. Within that, my personal view is that we already have, we actually have a lot of the interdependence, enough of it, and we have enough movement in anti-oppression right now for this post-growth shift. We actually have enough purpose-driven initiatives that we can point to. And we have enough examples of reciprocity, of giving and receiving. What I feel we don't have enough of to have a systems change right now is feelings of safety that allow for people to drop into connecting to all of these other pieces, and to allow for explorations to be creative rather than destructive. And I don't feel like we have a macroeconomics, a framework that is circular. It's what Jen and I have worked on, and hoping to finish off that book that we've published in draft, How on Earth. So to me, the first thing is every layer is important. Second point is that I think work in the space of governance and steward ownership is absolutely a fantastic acupuncture point. I see huge opportunities. I think that the areas that get, 10 years ago, a woman, Christian, in the US, moved money out of Wells Fargo into a credit union. It was a small amount of money. She posted it on Facebook, and it led to, I think, somewhere in the vicinity of $250 billion being moved. She inspired a movement. We haven't seen so many of those Move Your Money campaigns exist and since then, and I'm just surprised. I think that they're an incredible leverage point that we could build on her successes and do more of. The movement of money, power, resources, and advocacy and labor is definitely, in my opinion, an acupuncture point. But on the other side of it, and what we focus on today, is how do we create feelings of safety? How do we create safe spaces for people across difference to come together? And anyone who's doing work in that space, I take my hat off to you, because that to me is, we need that. We cannot shift to a post-capitalist, post-growth, post-patriarchal system until we have the feelings piece worked out, because what happens is anything that gets presented in space out of safety is going to get, as alternatives, is going to get branded as communism, socialism of the worst kind, etc. It's going to get tarnished with a brush, because that's the non-safe reaction to anything that feels threatening in that way, to something that, an ideology that someone's identity might be entwined in. So to unravel that entwining requires a gentleness, a dropping in, a moving into spaces of connection, of similarity, of most people in the US, for example, don't realize that there's over 120 million members of credit unions. The banking population in the US is only 250 million. You've got 122 million members of credit unions. Think about that. Like that's I think it's actually technically over 50%, 52%. So that means the majority of US citizens who bank have a credit union account. Most of them don't know that that's a non-extractive banking system that they're part of, a post-capitalist. It's definitely a socialist in terms of a broader understanding of socialism approach, because there's no ownership in credit unions, no private individual equity ownership. So like bringing people gently into an understanding of models that they're already participating in, to me, is a gateway and an acupuncture point to address your question there, Isabel. I'm going to hand back to Anna now, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Donnie. But before that, I noticed, Amanda, that you have your hand raised. And is that okay? Yeah, all good? Okay. Okay, I just wanted to make sure. Thank you, Donnie. So it's almost 2 minutes for 6:30 here in Spain, different hours in other parts of the country and other part of the planet. Donnie mentioned that he wanted to let you know that he's open to stay and continue with the conversation for those who have the opportunity. In 2 minutes, we're going to stop the recording, but he's opening his time. And if you want to stay here, I can leave the Zoom room for all of you to stay and continue this conversation with him. So I wanted to make that offer to all of you. That is really generous, like the whole time that we have spent together. I totally, when Isabel was talking about the calm that she was feeling during this talk, it resonated with me as well. It's probably one of the first spaces for a very long time that I have felt that I'm not in a hurry. So I want to be very, very grateful for Donnie, for everything that he has done with us today, with this for this experiment, for all the incredible chat, for all your contributions, for all your ideas, for all the, even for Diane, even that is skeptical comment, like it's super important. It's super important to listen to all of us in this safe space. I'm so grateful for all of you. So thank you. I'm going to start the recording now.